being born to a mother who is living with HIV and taking ARV, and your vaccine response together with the cell immune system. So there's a very strong evidence, but I think the approach now is to see how do we mitigate, which is do we delay the vaccine? Do we formulate a different vaccine entirely for these vulnerable infants? Because I think it would be very unethical to say the mom should not take.
This is Immuno Africa, a podcast dedicated to spotlighting African immunology research. Here, we amplify the stories of Africans researching the immune system to tackle the continent's growing burden of infectious and non-communicable diseases. I am Weld Okete, a biochemist and science communicator from Nigeria, keenly interested in research about the immune system. My interest in immunology began during my undergraduate days at the university. Over the years, that initial spark has steadily grown and found expression in multiple ways. On Immuno Africa, I explore and communicate research about the immune system through the eyes, hands, and lips of the Africans who do them. Whether you are a seasoned immunologist, a budding researcher interested in immunology, or an untrained lay person, I hope the time you spend here rewards you remarkably. This episode explores the works of Dr. Sonwabile Dzanibe, a South Africa-based research fellow at the University of Cape Town. With a background in biochemistry, Dr. Dzanibe is leveraging his knowledge of vaccinology and immunology to help the vulnerable children of HIV-infected mothers. His research focuses on developing vaccines for infants exposed to but uninfected by HIV. I guess that sounds strange. Well, if there are questions welling up in your mind already, chill, we'll get them all answered soon enough.
My name is Sonwabile Dzanibe, and I am a researcher at the University of Cape Town. So I'm currently doing immunological work in infants. So for the past 5 years, I think in 2017, I finished my PhD doing research in vaccinology, and then from there I moved into immunology in the University of Cape Town to do my postdoctoral research. So for the past 5 years, I was doing my postdoc, and then I just recently been appointed as a junior research fellow to continue doing immunology and vaccinology research. I graduated school back in 2007. Yeah, so from 2007, I started my BSc degree in University of Pretoria. I did biochemistry in the University of Pretoria, and then I subsequently did my honors there. And then following conclusion of my honors in biochemistry, I then moved to the University of Witwatersrand, which is known as WITS, to pursue a master's and PhD. But my master's was upgraded into a PhD, so I just graduated with a PhD degree from University of WITS, whereas, as I said, looking at vaccines, like vaccine design and development. And then following that, I then joined UCT to do my postdoc in immunology, where I continued research in infant immunology, and then now I'm doing both vaccinology and immunology again in infants.
At what point did you develop that interest in immunology research? Like you mentioned, you're a biochemist. Interestingly, I also studied biochemistry.
Oh, coming from, I think my high school days, coming from a township, we weren't really acquainted to what the scientist does, So what we did is that we only learn things as we enter the whole sphere of university. So when I started university, I knew I wanted to be a scientist, but I didn't know what particular type of a scientist. And then I knew I was good in biology. So I thought that was going to be a good start. So my first year in university, I did biological sciences because I wasn't sure which discipline I'm going to pursue. So I think that's a nice thing about University of Pretoria, where they allow you that first year to just do an overall degree, and then you can specialize from your second year. So I think I enjoyed chemistry in my first year. So I think that led me to pursue a field in biochemistry. So when I was doing biochemistry, I was trying to explore which specialization I can go into, but I think my interest was always in infectious diseases. So I wanted to find a career within infectious diseases, and I thought immunology was the best path to do infectious diseases. So when I did my honors degree, I wanted to be in a immunology lab. So that's where I started immunology stuff, but then soon got an interest in vaccine design and development. So that's why my PhD was then in vaccines. But by the end of my PhD, I realized that designing vaccines without knowing much about immunology is not going to be helpful. So I thought I need to marry the two. So that's what led me to doing a immunology degree immunology postdoc, so that I can get a more in-depth understanding of immunology, so I can then pursue this whole immunology and vaccine design going hand in hand, trying to get information from the immunology side to inform how to design vaccines, and then design a vaccine and then test its immunological responses. So I think that's how my career trajectory has actually been going.
I checked UCT website, and then your profile there reads that you are interested in the development of infant immune systems, and that you also have interest in the factors that influence childhood vaccines. So give us in-depth insight into what your research is currently on regards infant immunity and vaccine development.
Okay, so I started a postdoc in immunology in infants. So the idea is because it comes from the fact that I think there's been a number of reports showing that infants who are born from mothers who are living with HIV tend to succumb to illnesses at a higher rate compared to those who are not born from women living with HIV. So this was in infants who were not actually acquiring the infection. So due to perinatal antiretroviral treatment, these infants were not getting infected by HIV. So, but they were still getting sicker compared to those who were born to healthy moms. So the idea was to try and determine what is happening in the immune system that could potentially increase their risk to illnesses. So I think my postdoc research was focused on trying to understand those factors which are associated with being born from a mother who is living with HIV, even though the infant is not actually getting infected, or the baby is not getting infected. So that was my postdoc, where I was looking at the immune system, specifically looking at the T cell, or the cellular immune system, together with the anti-cell immune system. So trying to see if we can find that is there any difference that would lead to these infants being more vulnerable to diseases. So that was the idea behind the postdoc research. And I think the other thing was to also see if these differences will be associated with vaccine responses in infants. So that was the idea, to see what is changing in these infants in respect to their immune system, and does it associate with the vaccine responses in these infants, and also is it the factor that is contributing to them being more vulnerable to disease.
Okay, that's clear. That's quite clear. Something interesting about your research, when I was trying to just familiarize myself with it, was the idea that children who do not contract HIV from their mothers can actually be affected by the disease. Because I think the general idea people have about diseases is you're either infected or you're not infected. So it really was something interesting for me that it's possible to not be infected, but you're still affected by an infection or a disease. So I don't know how is that possible? How is it possible?
No, I think that is one fundamental thing that is very interesting. So, I mean, there's been a lot of data that is trying to understand the reason. So, but the overwhelming data was mostly because, when the whole pandemic began, or when people were starting to understand the pandemic, the advice that came was that you are potentially gonna infect your infant or your baby if you breastfeed your baby, right? So that meant that women who were living with HIV were advised not to breastfeed. Yeah. So I think that was one of the main contributing factors in terms of their babies becoming more sick, because now they're not getting those antibodies from the mom's breast milk to provide protection against these babies. So I think that was one of the main reasons where in the early 2000s, there was a lot of studies reporting that these infants, even though they're not getting infected by HIV, they actually become more likely to illnesses, which was because they were not receiving that passive antibodies from their mother's breast milk. So I think that was one of the contributing factors. So I think once they realized that, they then changed the regulations, saying, okay, no, especially in low resource countries where you're not actually, where proper sanitation, availability to clean waters and all those things are not necessarily there. So I think those ones, they then advise that those women should breastfeed so that they can actually provide protection to their babies. So I think once the breastfeeding was reinstituted, then there was a slight decrease in the number of the babies who were not who were getting sicker compared to those who were from healthy moms. But that didn't necessarily eliminate the risk. So these infants are still, or these babies are still being more vulnerable to disease. So now the idea is to try and understand what is probably continuing to cause this disease. So the theories was first is that one, their mothers are receiving antiretroviral treatment throughout pregnancy, so that could also influence the immune system. And the other theory was that given that these moms have chronic infection, that might be causing their immune system to be hyperactivated, and this hyperactivation of the immune system in the mothers will then create an environment for the development that the baby's immune system will develop, which will then alter it compared to those of mothers who are not living with HIV. And then because of those factors during development, the maternal factors can be imprinted in the baby, and therefore that will then result in the baby being more sick or more vulnerable in terms of their immune system is no longer the same as infants who are born from mothers who are not living with HIV. I think that was the main factor. So I think that's where my study came in, to try and see how is this immune system changed because of the mothers having HIV or undergoing antiretroviral treatment.
Okay, so I'll just try and do a brief recap of what you said to be sure we are on the same page. You are saying that the HIV infection in the mother, coupled with the medications they receive, the antiretrovirals they receive, are like possible contributing factors affecting the child's immune system and preventing it from having that optimal function.
Yes, correct. I think that is the bulk. So the HIV infection, because it will cause immune activation. So, and then that immune activation might create like an inflammatory environment for the baby to grow in, and then that environment is then imprinted in the baby's immune system and therefore alters it. The other thing is that they are receiving antiretroviral treatment, and therefore, so the baby is also exposed to those antiretroviral treatment during their development stage, while they're still in the womb, while they're still being fetuses. So those things and other factors can actually, I think, what we're suggesting could actually change the immune system of the infants. But what we wanted to understand is how is it changing. And I think what has been shown is that even the development of these babies is actually affected, not just the immune system, it's just also their growth and their neurological development, which is something to do probably more with taking antiretrovirals or being exposed to antiretrovirals very early in their development. I think In this era, HIV is, majority of these women have suppressed HIV viruses. So the viral load is, most of them is undetectable depending on when they started the ARV, whether before or during pregnancy. So the idea is that, yes, there's certain morbidities, illnesses that are associated with being HIV infected, which could be contributing as well to the immune of these mothers, which was then imprinted in these babies. But again, the exposure to antiretroviral drugs might also have its own impact, which is something that is worth pursuing and studying. I think there's a lot of researches now which are emerging, because now the babies are recommended to be breastfed, and then now the breastfeeding is that they're receiving the mother's antibodies, which does confer some protection. But the thing that is very clear is that these babies are born, majority of them, predominantly they become premature babies or born with low birth weight, which is something that is probably affecting their development during pregnancy, which is then shown to continue post-delivery. And I think that could be other factors that are just compromising these babies compared to just having HIV.
Well, that's a lot of information and to try and understand. So I think I have two questions for now. Regards the exposure to HIV and not getting infected, is this only possible with fetuses, like when the child is still in the mother's womb? Is that the only time that a child can be exposed to the virus and not be infected? Or is it possible after a child has been birthed?
Yeah, it's correct. I think that is the first recommendations that came from WHO, was that don't breastfeed because you'll pass the virus via your breast milk, right? So that's one reason why that recommendation was made, that you're trying to eliminate the transmission because breastfeeding has been shown to result in vertical transmission of the virus. So I think that recommendation was mainly implemented to prevent that transmission, because you can get it from the mother's breast milk. But majority of these women now, I think particularly in South Africa, the ARV treatment is the coverage is very high, and then majority of them are able to suppress the virus, and then with suppressing the virus, it's able for them to actually breastfeed without passing the virus to their babies. So I think the rates have drastically reduced. We saw a reduction from, I think, 20 to 40% of perinatal HIV infection down to about 2 to 3%. So I think you can see that the introduction of these ARVs did a very tremendous job in preventing HIV infection to the babies. But what now is being shown is that, so we have stopped infection, but we haven't necessarily eliminated what you already, the whole being affected.
So the recommendations that came from the World Health Organization and maybe from research was to curtail the spread of the infection from mothers to their infants. But yes, the implementation of those recommendations did not prevent the children from getting exposed to the virus, since the mothers have a lower viral load, and so it's possible that the children are still getting exposed to the viruses, but they are not being infected by the virus.
Wait, sorry. Let me just try and phrase the question in my own way to understand. Okay. You're saying that the recommendation was to try and prevent exposure to the virus, right?
No, prevent infection. Yeah, maybe through breast milk and the example you gave.
Yes. Yeah.
Okay, so I'm saying that the challenge now is that the infection is being prevented, but the children are still being exposed to the virus.
Yeah, so I think that is one of the questions that I think one of our research is trying to understand, because we're seeing that these women have viral suppression, right? So if there's no detectable virus in the mothers, are the infants or the babies really exposed to the virus? So I think that is the question we're trying to understand. Are these infants, are they really exposed, or is it other maternal factors that are probably contributing to these morbidities? Because I think pre-induction of ARVs during pregnancy, those infants were probably more exposed. But now the question is, to what extent are they exposed? So are they exposed to some viral peptides, but not the actual virus, or they're not exposed at all? And then other factors such as being exposed to antiretroviral treatment might be now the issue more than being exposed to the virus itself. I think there's been a couple of studies that have shown that the immune response or the memory of these babies have a recall to HIV peptides. But I think the question is still like, how much of the HIV are they seeing, or are they actively being exposed?
I must say it's really an interesting research, because there are several contributing factors that scientists are yet to maybe uncover, and even the factors that are quite clear. Scientists are still trying to understand the exact role they are playing. So it's really an interesting research, and thank you for simplifying and clarifying it. You just mentioned the point that would lead to the second question I have about the antiretrovirals. The idea that it's possible that these antiretrovirals could be contributing factors. I don't know if there are any steps being taken to kind of control, or I'm not sure the right word to use, but control the usage of these antiretrovirals, or perhaps replace them, improve them. Are there any studies or recommendations on that?
Yeah, I think that is a very controversial area, because now, you asking, do you stop taking antiretrovirals because they probably having certain factors which are not really ideal for the baby?
Yes.
Yeah, but now if you do that, then you now risking the babies in contracting HIV. So I think that is something that is very difficult to navigate. But I think the discipline now, especially in my area, is to try and see how do you improve vaccine responses. How do you, like, for instance, how do you we're trying to find the gaps in the immune system, which is probably caused by HIV exposure, or mostly, I think in this particular case, ARV exposure, in terms of seeing, okay, how do we ensure that the vaccines are optimal in these babies so that they don't become vulnerable to diseases. So I think that is what we are currently looking at. So I think there's interesting studies which are coming out, even in our group, where we're seeing there is some association between being born to a mother who is living with HIV and taking ARV, and your vaccine response together with the cell immune system. So there is a very strong evidence, but I think the approach now is to see how do we mitigate, which is, do we delay the vaccine? Do we formulate a different vaccine entirely for these vulnerable infants? Because I think it would be very unethical to say the mom should not take antiretrovirals, which we know would prevent vertical transmission to the baby. So I think that is something that, unless we come with a formula of preventing HIV from transmitting that doesn't necessarily have any impact to the baby, then that would be great. But yeah, for now, I think the idea is to try and see how do you improve the baby's life while the mom is continuously taking ARVs.
Okay, so rather than kind of stopping the medications for the mothers, let's focus on how we can help the babies overcome that hurdle.
Correct. Yeah, I think that is the approach until better drug is designed. I think there is a lot of research going into trying to improve the drugs. I know there's the PrEP, which is going to be interesting to see how it also translates, because now we find people who do not have HIV but taking PrEP. So I think that is going to be very fascinating to understand. I think we'll be able to tease out the role of PrEP alone and not in combination with HIV. So we're trying to see, okay, when you're taking antiretroviral drugs during pregnancy, what does that do to the immune system, even if you are not living with HIV? So I think there's going to be some interesting research which will then make the analysis of the data more specific to ARV and therefore not confounded by HIV. But I mean, that is very early on. So I think in the couple of years, we might see something more specific to the drugs, and then taking better approaches on how to advise these pregnant women and how to protect the babies themselves.
Okay, that's fine then. That's cool. So you mentioned PrEP, so I think we should just clarify what PrEP is for people who might not be familiar with the acronym.
Oh, sorry. So it's a prophylactic drug. So you take the pill to prevent getting HIV. So usually you take antiretroviral or ARVs when you're already infected to try and reduce the viral load or to just suppress the virus. But PrEP is to try and prevent being infected. So you have to take it when you suspect that you might be at higher risk to getting infected.
Okay, thank you very much for that. What is research without challenges? Challenges are to the scientists what spices are to soups. We need only enough of them to keep us invested in our research, but when they get overwhelming, we may as well become disinterested. I asked Dr. Dzanibe to share some of the challenges that characterize his unique research and did not let him go until he gave a few words of advice for up and coming scientists. I would be talking now about some of the challenges you faced conducting this research. Just share with us some of the challenges that you've had to grapple with in your research journey.
Yeah, so I think if I'm discussing challenges, because I'm not a clinician, so I'm not necessarily in the clinic. I'm mostly in the lab. Right? But I mean, with terms with, I mean, there's a lot of issues when you are trying to deal with babies, right? Because when you're doing research, babies can't accept, they cannot, consent to what is being done to them. So I think that's one of the major issues, is that now we have to ask the moms who are holding this precious baby to say, can they be included in our study? Can we poke them, take these samples to try and understand what's happening in them? Although, I mean, it can be a challenge. I think majority of the people in the study are actually interested in actually saving their babies. So I think with proper advocating to why you're doing this research, majority of these women are actually happy to participate. But I think the challenge when it comes to this is usually how, as you're saying, funding. So I think you're more familiar with that, the South Africa, together with the African continent in general, tend to have a higher disease burden, right? And also on top of this, the majority of the population is unemployed. So now the ethical dilemma is that how do you get these women and their babies to be included in the study, and then you find that consenting or having a proper ethical procedure is usually very difficult when you try to determine, especially when you say, okay, we're gonna subsidize for your transport and your time, and therefore then that borders on, are you coercing them to participate? So I think that is something that is a thread that we need to try and see where it goes when it comes to doing studies in places where the population is very vulnerable, and therefore how do you have proper consenting, and then all the ethics done correctly? Because I think there's a lot of cases where we find that people are just enticing the study participants with money, and therefore they now are thinking, okay, I know you're saying it's ethical to compensate for my time, but my time was going to be sitting at home, and therefore it becomes a conflict of interest. So I think that is one issue which I think we are facing in the African continent. I think that is another thing that's you start to see emerge, where we have papers being published from Africa, where the samples are taken in Africa, but there's no African author, where it becomes very interesting to see that they came for the samples, and therefore then after the samples, then they continue doing their research, and then they do it in their silos. So I think that's something that is a bit concerning. I think that also comes with funding, where are you able to attract funding to be able to do this research, and then not necessarily have other countries which are higher income countries coming to collect samples in our back door and then leaving these women still vulnerable and not understanding. Because I think one important thing that has to be done is to also educate, because these people are there trying to understand what's wrong with their babies. So if you're gonna just take samples and then disappear without educating them, then you have not accomplished your entire goal.
Yeah.
In terms of I think what that is supposed to be doing. So I think that is the thing that I'm mostly concerned about. But in terms of challenges in the lab, I think it's usually the similar challenges which probably face most researchers, is trying to source funding to do your research.
Okay. So you've talked about getting funding for your research. Then you've also touched on ethical issues regards conducting research in African setting, or maybe low resource settings, like you mentioned, vulnerable communities. And then I think you also branched into the whole idea of helicopter research, where people just come in and get samples and take them somewhere else to analyze and come up with results about Africa that do not involve Africa in the process, if I should put it that way.
Yeah, I mean, that is the best way to summarize it.
So thank you very much for your time. Thank you very much for simplifying your research for us. Your very, very, very interesting research. I think I would still have to digest some of the things you've mentioned after this podcast. One last thing. So perhaps you have a word or something to say to young people who would be interested in research in immunology or related areas. So just something to just to encourage, to cheer them up, or to just give them a heads up of what research in immunology is like.
You're saying words of encouragement for upcoming students?
Yes, with interest in research.
Okay, all right. I think it's something that I probably say a lot. I think, or maybe something that is very cliche, is having the love of research. I think what most students do not understand is the academic system, right? But I think if you have the love of research, the love of knowledge, trying to understand things, I think that is what we as scientists fundamentally is to try and understand things beyond anything else, is to just love doing your work. So I think that is something that usually is very important really early on to actually enjoy what you're doing. So what I can say is in your early days in doing research, what is fundamental is, one, be able to report on what you are doing. So I think that is very crucial. Always be thinking of how do you share your information with the public sector, with the scientific community as well, because I think that helps put you in a specific area, because now you are known as this person who does the specific research, which I think puts you in a better position to actually get funded for your research, because now you have been reporting it and people can see your track record. Because I think most students, I know it's the primary goal is to get your degree, just graduate and then see the next chapter. But I think during that process of getting your degree, I think it is also very important to try and get your work out, so that people know what you're doing, and therefore you can have a record. But while doing this, don't lose your love for research, for doing science.
Okay, thank you very much for those points. So I think I will summarize them as the need to understand what you're doing, love what you're doing, and talk about it to the right people, to the public sector, and also to the scientific community. Thank you very much, Dr. Sonwabile Dzanibe, for your time. I really enjoyed our conversation, and hopefully I think I would bring you back again. So sometime in the future to tell us the progress you've made, trying to untie this sort of Gordian knot of understanding HIV in mothers and infants.
No, hopefully in a couple of years I should have something more concrete than theories.
So thank you very much for your time, and enjoy the rest of your evening. I am still ruminating on how complex, multifactorial, or weird research can be, especially because of the many answers scientists try to provide in their quest to manage diseases. What struck you the most about Dr. Dzanibe's research? You can follow this podcast on Instagram and Twitter at ImmunoAfrica. On LinkedIn, it's the Immunology in Africa podcast. And do well to connect with me across social media at World Okete. Thank you for listening.